And every business needs decision useful data to make the right choices about how to develop the business, about where to go strategically, about how to transition away from fossil fuels. There's a lot of information that's needed for good business practice.
Welcome to The Sustainable Edge, your podcast that moves sustainability beyond talk. You get to hear sharp perspectives and leave with insights you can put into action. I'm your host, Joachim Nahum, and this podcast is produced by Position Green. Today, I'm speaking with the original standard setter of corporate sustainability reporting, the Global Reporting Initiative. GRI was born out of public outrage in the early 1990s after the Exxon Valdez oil spill, a moment that locked in a simple idea. If corporations shape society, they must also be held accountable. Fast forward to 2026, and the idea still stands. But accountability has widened. It's no longer just about environmental damage. It's about data and privacy, the power of tech platforms, executive pay, social inequality, and basic questions are right and wrong in business. This is happening as companies navigate a far tougher landscape, a weakening rules-based order, rising populism and geopolitics, and AI rapidly reshaping work, from factory floors to offices and boardrooms. Expectations on companies and their leaders have never been higher or less clear. To explore what's changed and what hasn't, I'm joined by Robin Hodess, CEO of GRI. With a career spanning finance, ethics, and global governance, Robin brings a long-term view to corporate transparency. So the question is simple. In this moment, what does meaningful accountability really look like? Robin, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Joachim.
So, Robin, I want to start with that. I believe you were in Davos in January. And this year, it attracted a lot of attention, not just for the headlines, but also the mood. And as we head into 2026, what would you describe, or how would you describe where we are right now when it comes to corporate accountability and sustainability reporting?
Well, thanks for the question. It certainly was a difficult start to the year, and that was after an already difficult 2025. I think in 2025, we saw some headwinds set in that I don't expect will change anytime too soon. That was the first year that I would say we really experienced a longer pushback on sustainability as a space, as an ecosystem. And that was difficult. And that was because of what you said, the geopolitics or geoeconomics in Davosian, looking at the way politics is moving and the focus on tariffs and security and a whole bunch of other issues. So I think it's been challenging, but I think the longer term story is a good one. The tracks are laid, the train is moving, perhaps a bit slowly. But I think what's happening is we're seeing sustainability emerge in new ways. So we're not talking about it as sustainability, like a separate thing. We're talking about it in terms of water use by AI data centers. We're talking about land use and regenerative agriculture. We're looking at privacy. So it's a whole number of issues that really matter now to business, and that business is taking up, including, of course, the just transition and transitioning away from fossil fuels. But it's a whole range of issues that now become the very succinct and specific articulation of what sustainability means in 2026 and in the future.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Robin, because what you're doing here is you're challenging maybe the concept of where we often have these rankings in terms of what's top of mind for CEOs. And it will be geopolitics as one topic, sustainability, AI. It could be a number of others. And that they sort of keep moving up or down depending on the survey that year. But what you're saying is that rather than thinking of climate or sustainability as a separate topic and where high or low it is on the agenda of the CEO, that it's wrapped into all these other things, whether it's geopolitics or AI or even trade. And coming out of Davos, of course, we learned, or what received a lot of attention was the Carney speech about thinking about middle powers who can come together for specific topics and sort of move the the needle on that. So if I understand you correctly, you're saying sort of sustainability is actually wrapped into all these other things that may now be higher up on the agenda for CEOs than as a topic on its own.
Yes, I think if the pandemic showed us anything, it's how interconnected all these challenges are. And it's very difficult for a business to focus on just one aspect, say, addressing its climate issues without thinking about its governance, without thinking about how it's addressing human rights or stakeholder engagement. There's been a huge, advance by companies in terms of the pressure on them for corporate accountability. And I think overall, it's shown how interrelated the many ways a company has an impact on people and planet.
And we're going to come back to this topic of materiality. If you help our listeners conceptually understand how GRI and sort of materiality works, it's taking these sort of topics that corporates encounter to a larger or lesser degree, depending on where they are and the sector they work in. But it's essentially trying to sort of map this world of materiality. And if we go back to sort of Exxon Valdez, which was this moment where we understood that oil spills, it's terrible, and it was very visceral, and you could see it, and you understand that corporates somehow have a responsibility. But if we fast forward now, there are a lot of topics out there that need to sort of fit this materiality map. What are some of these other topics that we see now in 2026? You mentioned AI, data centers. Just help our listeners understand a little bit like how your organization works with orienting companies in 2026 on what's material and what these topics are.
Well, I guess I'd say that the easiest and most common entry point for sustainability issues has been climate change. But as you said, the impacts that companies have really span the whole environmental, social, and governance space. And although there are parts of the world where we're not speaking about ESG anymore, there are other parts of the world where the approach to reporting on impacts according to ESG is thriving. But I think one area that's really grown in the last year and which has a lot of promise for supporting this holistic approach to sustainability and impacts is the area of nature. There's been a huge interest in water and land use and on the effects that companies are having on people through their use of resources. And I think people can connect to nature in many ways. It's about how they live, where they live, how they engage with their um, community and with the natural resources in their backyards or where they travel to or where their family spends time. So I think that for all of us, the nature issue can really bring sustainability home, and it has proved an extremely interesting and important way for companies to begin to report on their impacts. So GRIs get a biodiversity standard, and there are other frameworks out there that we're aligning with to really bring nature into the sustainability reporting landscape.
And do you think going back to this, sorry that I keep pulling us back to the Exxon Valdez moment, but it is something about birds covered in oil or oceans, as you said, people and I guess other businesses can relate to this. So the sort of power of nature, is that tapping into this idea of holding corporates accountable that, okay, so who's responsible for that we're losing species or that we're losing plants or that rainforest is disappearing and the commons, the land we use, the marshes, et cetera, et cetera. Is that sort of tapping into this idea that we need to hold ourselves accountable as a society and that hasn't disappeared 30, 40 years later? That is still very much alive, this sense.
Yeah, there's still a strong sense that, there's a tragedy of the commons and that the commons aren't priced and that we're not really dealing with the cost um, to ourselves of depleting resources, that we're exceeding planetary boundaries. So the news is tough, and we know that getting through tough news can be difficult, but we need to look at the opportunities that we do see coming from all kinds of new technologies to address these issues. And I think that all the experts would say that a lot of the solutions are there. Um, Thinking about nature and animals and species, of course, is a very concrete thing that people can relate to. So I do think that helps make nature an important and a really relevant part of where people can conceive sustainability needs to move. But I think it's also the importance of nature's link to climate, its impact on climate, and on other issues that have to do with well being for people. So I do think it's a very holistic issue that a lot of us can relate to. And it's also a very important one for business to seize opportunities and really be a part of change.
And how do we balance this, seen from an executive's perspective, meaning that this board of Materiality has evolved tremendously. As you said, it's not just nature or climate, it's a raft of issues. And at the same time, it's easy, I think, for corporates and executives to be overwhelmed and saying, wait, hold on a second. I'm responsible for my business, all these things happening in the world, from politics domestically to geopolitics. Am I supposed to own this or be responsible? What about running my everyday business? How do we sort of balance this for corporates? Also, that if they are going to have an impact, that they focus their time and their resources. Even for large corporates, there's a limit to resources and time. So how do we sort of balance this, that there's so many topics emerging and that we actually get things done, or
Well,
hold them accountable for the right things?
I think that's part of the rethink. So sustainability, challenged quite a bit in 2025, feeling the headwinds, looking at that as an opportunity to say, what's essential about sustainability? How do we get the credibility back to say to sustainability and to the issues that we focus on? And I think a lot of that is because really quality sustainability reporting is in its essence data. And every business needs decision useful data to make the right choices about how to develop the business, about where to go strategically, about how to transition away from fossil fuels. There's a lot of information that's needed for good business practice. And so, if we can see reporting as a critical element of the information ecosystem that's needed for business and good, sustainable business growth, then it's not so much this thing you do on the side. It's not compliance. It's not a checklist. It's actually critical decision making strategic information that every business needs.
And on that topic, like, how do we move reporting from being both a kind of clerical exercise where it just becomes like accounting, but also compliance? How do we sort of get to that point that it has real business value, that it engages boards and executives, and where it has a business value? Because that's the other thing that's emerged from 25 to 26, is that we kind of lost our pathway on sustainability as sort of being a separate exercise and not really tying it to the business. What advice do you have for executives to sort of do this more in practice, like that it has this real business value, saying that this is the model for 26? How do we actually do it?
Well, you mentioned boards. I mean, there are more and more boards that are exercising their oversight role on sustainability. That's a growing area for board committees to be involved. There's OECD research that confirms that. But there's a whole number of ways that executives can move forward and management can move forward, really looking at sustainability as a part of risk management, seeing it as foresight data. Um, right now, we're in a moment when we're seeing a growth across the sustainability reporting landscape. And a lot of that new focus is on reporting on financial materiality of sustainability. And to get to that, in many cases, you first need to understand your impacts. So, having a really good holistic understanding of impacts actually helps you as a business to know where financial risk and opportunity is likely to emerge. So, there are a whole number of ways that impact information and sustainability impacts can be extremely relevant to business development, and financial reporting.
And Robin, tell me a little bit more about the Global Reporting Initiative in terms of how the number of companies and where they're from. You engage with a lot of companies, or they engage with your standards, but you obviously get feedback and you speak to a lot of your users, I guess, also not just from the OECD, but it's I think it's important to emphasize it's a global standard. So not just the EU or OECD. What are you hearing and learning from them in terms of how they engage with these standards? And also that you are part of a larger process of trying to harmonize standards. Yours is a voluntary standard, but there's obviously a lot that's happened on the regulatory side. So maybe two questions for you there. First, what are your your community of users saying? And secondly, where does GRI fit into this larger landscape of trying to harmonize standards? As this is something we've heard from corporates that it's very confusing, even if we can agree on impact as something important. Like, what standard do we follow?
Well, you're right, Joachim. There's a really high global use of the GRI standards. About 3 in 4 of the world's largest companies report using GRI. And we're still seen as the go-to for existing reporting on sustainability. GRI has been around for almost 30 years. And about 15 years ago, we became a sustainability standard. And that was in a time when there weren't other standards, there weren't other approaches. And of course, we could see it as a sign of our success that that space is now busier. There are more opportunities and options for what companies can report to. Luckily, I think we've recognized, along with others, that it's important to connect, to converge, to collaborate, so that companies will, over time, see that reporting with one standard is a complement to the other standards out there and isn't double reporting. There is a risk right now with the way geopolitics are moving that different jurisdictions are going to have different requirements. And that fragmentation is worrying, both from our point of view, but also from the point of view of reporters. So it isn't just the number of frameworks, but it's the number of jurisdictions that are requiring different things. And we really need to lean into a multilateral system and approach that helps make it simpler. Big companies have a very wide and big footprint. There's a lot of suppliers in the value chain. We need to connect the dots for the real economy and make all of this reporting connect together and really make it a bit simpler. So that's one of the things we're hearing. We're hearing a plea from companies to please simplify and make sure that all of us who are in the standard setting and framework business are working together. And we're very committed as GRI to that. So I think that the important thing to note is that companies in some parts of the world are really feeling the pressure to be a part of this system. And we have to give them an easier entree into this world of sustainability reporting to make them viable as that information is going to be needed from them for them to be good business and trading partners.
And are there any positive headlines? We keep being bombarded with, I would say, negative news, at least in an OECD setting, either about the EU standard setting, so-called omnibus, turning into a little bit of a debacle where they say one thing and then they have to pull back. And then there's all this confusion on sort of what is the standard and is it regulation or not? Is there something happening outside our OECD bubble? You mentioned other jurisdictions that we should be optimistic about in this sort of sense that other markets that are maybe faster growing markets from a economic perspective that actually want to have these standards as part of their economy.
Absolutely. I think it goes without saying that the world is watching the ASEAN markets, the China market really grow in terms of commitment to sustainable economic growth and bringing in sustainability reporting at great pace and with great ambition. China's just released the first draft of its sustainability standards. We're going to see its commitment there to what we call double materiality, both the impact reporting that GRI focuses on, but also the financial materiality. So, how to bring sustainability into your financial reporting. And that's very positive in terms of seeing such a big market committed. Many countries in Africa, also in Latin America, continue to show commitment. But I think it's important. What you asked about before was GRI and how we're making inroads when we're a voluntary standard. It's true that we're voluntary and that our roots are in companies and sectors recognizing the value of sustainability reporting and the importance not only to the business, but also for investors and for license to operate, et cetera. But we're really seeing that in soft law, in rulemaking that's held by stock exchanges and a lot of different kinds of regulation. GRI is recommended and referenced, and I think that helps create a very strong enabling environment that can help bring some of these jurisdictional pieces and fragmentation closer together. And that's what we need to work toward, is more unity and clarity on reporting frameworks.
And on this, you gave some really interesting examples of other markets that are fast growing and moving ahead with embracing or at least engaging with sustainability standards. I'm just wondering, why are we not hearing more about that? Maybe it's the algorithms of my news feed that are sort of tuned into OECD-centric or perhaps negative headlines. Why aren't we hearing more about, as you said, China, South America? We've had a previous guest on the podcast here where we discussed the recent trade agreement between the EU and Mercosur, who said the South American countries already moved ahead on this. Brazil, Argentina, in terms of setting sustainability standards. So it's not like the EU is coming and saying you have to now follow our standards and it's somehow a enforcement of European rules on an emerging market. They're saying that this is already worked into both national and corporate standards. So why aren't we hearing more about this? ASEAN markets are obviously a very important part of global growth. Why are we sort of a little bit caught in our own doom and gloom European or Western bubble? What do you think?
Well, you said it yourself that doom and gloom grabs the headlines, as do a lot of really worrying and disturbing issues in terms of geopolitics and risks, really, to many aspects of our multilateral system. But I think it could be a reflection that business is just getting on with this, and that where we are now is more in a doing and action moment where companies and investors looking to move into sustainable finance are recognizing that we actually need to do the work, and we need to find the modalities and the ways to understand where companies are, where markets are on sustainability. And they're moving forward in a kind of maybe quieter but more diligent way to really start to make things happen. I mean, one of the concerns that you could argue was part of the pushback on sustainability was the great claims that were made that everything's green and everything was sustainable. And that really posed a threat, I think, to the credibility of the sustainability ecosystem. And so now we're, recouping and I think getting back to business, which is to say we need data, we need evidence, we need signs of progress. For example, our new climate standard is very focused on transition planning. And I think that's been seen as an extremely constructive way for businesses to begin to make it the right steps towards change. In addition to having net zero targets, it's important to report on a regular basis how you're actually planning for the transition. And so this is something about getting back to business and getting back to basics in terms of reporting.
Great. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I want to ask you a bit slightly different type of question, perhaps wearing one of your previous hats. You were with Transparency International and ethics, obviously still an important part of, if you like, ESG sustainability and perhaps the G on governance, how boards hold executives accountable, etc. So there have been quite a lot of, again, I'd say negative headlines from even if we go back to, I think it was the latter end of 25, where for a long time now we've had some anti-corruption standards for countries and corporates. So including the Foreign Corruption Practices Act in the United States, which the Trump administration rolled back, or at least that was the announcement. Obviously, with the current Epstein files, we're also hearing about corporates and executives who are caught up in that. So there's perhaps a perception that we're now back to, if not the 80s or the 90s, the unregulated one where corporates and executives can kind of do unethical deals and that there is no regulation, or that maybe they always were corrupt. How does that mirror with what you see maybe as the more long-term trend if we look at corporate behavior and ethical standards versus some recent headlines that may lead people to think that we're not holding corporates accountable?
Well, I think that it's important to distinguish to some extent, as you have, between sustainability reporting and corporate accountability. Of course, sustainability reporting is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. And the corporate accountability part, as you say, is something that's a perennial topic. And right now, there's a couple elements that I think have come back, if you want to say. And one is about undue influence and the issue that we've seen in many times in history about the power of corporates. We know that lobbying per se is a legitimate activity, but we need clarity and transparency on lobbying in order to understand its scope and its impact. And only through that transparency can we understand really what companies are doing. It's really important, for example, if a company is committed publicly to good human rights policies and good environmental practices, that they're actually lobbying in the same way. That consistency is really important. And I think another element that's emerged in terms of corporate accountability, and that is on everyone's mind, is how to be a leader right now. How can businesses lead at a time when we need leadership and we need clarity, and businesses sometimes are uncomfortable in that role. Business leaders are uncomfortable. Now, that doesn't mean that a company needs to do the work of government, but clearly where a business has a role in a society and an impact in a society, it does need to show accountability and responsibility towards community. And I think a lot of people around the world are looking at business leaders and wishing and hoping for them to be a part of a positive way forward.
So, Robin, on this topic of going beyond compliance, real business value, that is, that sustainability reporting or impact, if you like, is somehow tied to the business case for corporates, that it has also a financial value, either destructive or creative value. Do we have examples of this?
Well, we did some research at GRI last year. We looked at a whole number of studies that have looked at the correlation between sustainability reporting and financial impact. And 73% of those studies show a positive correlation there. So for companies that are doing good sustainability reporting, they are able to demonstrate a strong business case around that work and that effort.
Very interesting. I think we're going to drop that study, if it's publicly available, in the notes. At Position Green, we also have a current research project going with Stockholm School of Economics exactly on this topic in terms of correlating sustainability reporting to financial performance. And I know there's a great interest in that. So we're going to make sure we get those in our notes for the podcast here. Great. And to end on a slightly more non-reporting or standard-setting note, Robin, I asked my previous guest about the World Cup and football, but is there something in the category of trivial, or it's not that sports and music necessarily are trivial, that you would like to share with our listeners? Is there some music or literature you've discovered recently that's given you a little bit break from sustainability reporting and standard setting? Something you want to share with our listeners?
Well, I have a 20 and 23-year-old kids, and their music is always a great mystery to me, although I try. And through recent, let's say, geopolitical events and important broadcasts, I finally now know who Bad Bunny is.
Robin, thank you so much for joining us on Sustainable Edge. And I promise we will put in the notes all of your recommendations, from research to musical recommendations, from essentially sustainability and business correlation to Bad Bunny. It's all going to be in the notes. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity, Joachim.
That's it for this episode of Sustainable Edge. If you found today's conversation inspiring, make sure to subscribe and leave us a review. It helps more sustainability leaders find us.